Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining SIM, MTM, and the GCRF Mine Dust and Health Network on this afternoon program. So just to kick us off, before we start a bit of some ground rules, just a reminder, please, as you enter, just remember to mute your mic because all participants will be able to participate in the Q&A session. So please just ensure that your mic is muted. And after that, we can have some bit of introductions, and that will take us off right into the presentation. So we're going to have two presentations, as the mailer has probably alluded to, and that will be Associate Professor Dyllon Randall, and we'll have Helene-marie having the second presentation. To kick us off and give us a bit of background, I'll ask Associate Professor Jennifer Broadhurst to give us some background to this whole presentation. Jenny, it's your time.
Edwin, there I am, and I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes, so I can see it.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. As Clevin has already mentioned, the forum session this afternoon is being co-hosted by the Global Challenges Research Fund, Mine, Dust and Health Network, which has been established as a collaborative, transdisciplinary and intersectoral think tank that is designed to inform research as well as policy and practice in terms of addressing the issues and challenges associated with the emission of dust from mining-related activities. And today our session focuses on addressing the challenges of mine tailings. Now, as most of you are probably aware, the mining sector generates large quantities of finely ground tailings, which are conventionally disposed of in tailings impoundments. And these impoundments tend to be one of the major sources of dust emissions, both during and after the life of mine. So historically, mitigation of these impacts has focused largely on the use of some sort of cover to limit wind erosion. But these erosions have yet to be proven effective in the long term and sometimes even in the short term, with dust emissions from both active and defunct tailings impoundments impacting on the local environment, as well as the quality of life and the health of surrounding communities in many mining intensive jurisdictions around the world, such as the diagram, the slide here shows, the Witwatersrand gold fields in South Africa. So as tragic as it was, the Brumadinho tailings dam collapse in Brazil in January 2019 really served to bring the long-term risks associated with tailings impoundments to the fore. And certainly those of us who have been in the game for a relatively long time have really seen a shift in the industry's attitude and concerns over tailings in the last couple of years. And whilst the main focus to date may have been primarily on geotechnical stability of tailings impoundments, we have also seen a growing interest, particularly from the larger multinational companies, in the so-called waste to resource approach, which is concerned with not only recovering the residual grams per ton of metal value from tailings, but also in repurposing the bulk material as feedstock for other uses, such as mine tailings or as building aggregate, ultimately completely removing the tailings impoundments and the associated pollution and human health risks, particularly those associated with dust. So at UCT, we have been and continue to be involved in or conducting a number of research projects for the development of innovative technologies and integrated approaches for repurposing large volume mine waste tailings. And Dyllon Randall is going to talk to you about one of these options this afternoon. But we also recognize that technology transfer is a crucial step in the innovation value chain. And so thus also been conducting research on the barriers, enablers, and opportunities for the commercialization of mine waste repurposing technologies. And Helene-marie will share some insights into her work on this subject in a second presentation this afternoon. So I'm hoping that these two presentations will serve to stimulate some interesting conversations. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Dyllon to share his slides. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about repurposing mine tailings using microbial-induced calcium carbonate precipitation. So we call this MICP for short. And I'm going to start with the modern sanitation system. So I realize that you might think, well, this is a bit strange because this is a mining talk. And yeah, you have a guy now talking about sanitation, but I hope you will see the synergies and why we're doing this kind of work from my talk. So if we look at the modern sanitation system, specifically the toilet, we see that we combine our feces and our urine with good quality water, only to flush it away to a wastewater treatment plant where we spend significant amounts of money and energy to remove three key nutrients, namely nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But if we focus on this wastewater stream more specifically on the urine component, we see that the urine only makes up about 1% of the total volume of the wastewater. Yet it contains 80% of the nitrogen, 70% of the potassium, and 50% of the phosphorus. Now, these are three key nutrients needed to make any inorganic fertilizer, and we literally flush them away every day. So how could we collect this urine instead? Well, we could use a no-mix toilet, and like the name suggests, it doesn't mix the feces and the urine. Or we could use a urinal to directly collect urine. And don't worry, ladies, unisex urinals do exist. In terms of the impact that urine separation has on the wastewater treatment system, so when we look at a typical wastewater treatment system and specifically biological nutrient removal, we see that we actually require energy to treat this wastewater. But if we implement source separation and specifically separate urine and the subsequent nutrients, we see that our wastewater treatment plant can actually start producing energy. Now, when we look at urine, we have to focus on the fact that there's a substantial amount of resources in it, and predominantly the fact that there's 90% of the nitrogen, which is fixed as urea. Now, this urea degrades in the presence of an enzyme called urease and produces CO2, ammonia, or ammonium, depending on the pH of the solution. Now, you can prevent this reaction from occurring by operating at a low pH. And we recently found that you can also do this by operating at a high pH. And when we look specifically at this urea degradation in urine, so what this graph is showing us is a gradual increase in the amount of ammonia being produced. So we know that that reaction is occurring. But when we add the urease, the enzyme, we see that there's a rapid increase in the amount of ammonia being produced, meaning that that reaction is happening even faster. But when we add something like calcium hydroxide, we see that we don't have an increase in the ammonia. So this tells us that the reaction is not occurring even though we have the enzyme present. But it's not so much the fact that we've added calcium hydroxide, but rather it's the fact that we've increased the pH of the solution significantly. Now, to understand this better and the implications of this, we have to understand solubility. So I know for many of you, you would understand this, but for some you might not. So I'm going to give you a very simple example of sugar dissolving in water. So imagine you're having your coffee in the morning and you take a teaspoon of sugar and you dissolve it at 100 degrees. All of the sugar would dissolve. In fact, a whole jar of sugar would still dissolve at 100 degrees. You would need a whopping 4.75 kgs of sugar before no more sugar would dissolve. at 100 degrees. If you do this at 25 degrees, you would only need 2.2 kgs. So doing this for a full range of temperatures, you get what is called a solubility curve. So if I have a teaspoon of sugar below the curve, I have an undersaturated solution, and a teaspoon of sugar just on the curve, so the right amount, I have a saturated solution. And if I have an amount over and above this curve, I have a supersaturated solution. And the difference between the solubility curve and this point is the amount of solid that remains in the solution. What we see is that as the temperature increases, the solubility of our sugar increases as well. But when we look at the solubility now of calcium hydroxide, we see that as we increase the temperature, the solubility decreases. Calcium hydroxide is said to have an inverse solubility curve. We also see that the amount needed to create a saturated solution is far less than our sugar example. So when we look at the amount needed to create a saturated solution and specifically focus on the pH because that's our key parameter, and we compare the saturated solution of, say, water and urine, which have vastly different compositions, we see that the saturation pH is the same regardless of the composition. But when we look at different urine compositions, so each curve here represents a different urine composition, we see that the amount needed to create a saturated solution, which gives us that fixed pH, varies depending on composition. So to compensate for the fact that my urine is going to be very different to your urine, we recommend a dosage of 10 grams of calcium hydroxide per liter of urine you would want to treat. So to summarize, the amount of calcium hydroxide dissolving depends on the composition, but the saturation pH is fixed at a specific temperature. This allowed us to develop a design chart of sorts, where we have temperature on the x-axis and pH on the y-axis. And now the green region is where we can limit or reduce the loss of urea simply by operating at a relatively low temperature and high pH. So this is our ideal operating region. And what this allowed us to do is to develop a passive dosing system. So imagine you have a container to which you add your calcium hydroxide, and then you simply add urine. So a smaller amount of the calcium hydroxide would dissolve, and someone else comes along and adds more urine, and a little more of the calcium hydroxide dissolves. Provided you have enough calcium hydroxide for the volume of urine you want to treat, you maintain a high pH, and hence you prevent that reaction from occurring, and you keep all your urea in solution. So this allowed us to develop a fertilizer-producing urinal. And so it consists of a removable container with a funnel and a splashback to which you simply add your calcium hydroxide and then your urine. And what this does is almost within 30 seconds, you remove about 96% of the phosphorus from your urine as calcium phosphate because you've increased the pH of the urine. But you also retain all the urea in solution because the pH is a high value. So what this allows us to do now is overcome many of the challenges associated with urine collection. And some of these are the fact that you have to retrofit a plumbing system if you want to install this in an existing building, which is often expensive. Our urinals are standalone and don't have to be connected to a plumbing system. Secondly, if you send concentrated urine through pipes, they eventually start building up a scale in the pipe. The irony is that these scale components are actually valuable fertilizers. What we do with our fertilizer-producing urinal is we force them to be produced within the removable container. And then finally, waterless urinals can smell if not managed properly. And this is mainly because of the buildup of ammonia, but because we prevent this from occurring, we don't have issues with smell. Because it's a waterless urinal, we save significant amounts of water. Up to 30% of an individual's daily water usage can be saved by simply adopting such systems. In addition, I have to use UCT as an example. We were using about 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water just to flush the urinals on upper campus. And this was prior to a drought. So these kinds of initiatives can help us save precious water. What this also allows us to do is to obviously produce valuable fertilizer. And so UCT requires about 4 tons of fertilizer to fertilize their sports field. And if we collected all the urine just from urinals on upper campus, we have the potential to produce 7 tons of fertilizer per year. Now I come to what else can we do with this urine? So now we come back to this reaction, but now we focus on the production of carbonate ions. Now we want this reaction to occur. And so imagine you take any loose material, such as sand, mine tailings, or any aggregate, and you colonize it with bacteria that produce the enzyme urease, and then you add urea and calcium, which would come from your urine. What would happen is the urea breaks down to form carbonate ions, then combines with the calcium to form calcium carbonate. And what this does is it essentially cements the loose sand particles together. It's very similar to how calcium carbonate caves are made, or shells, or coral reefs. Essentially what we're doing, we're taking inspiration from nature, but this is the star of the show, Sporacina pasteurii. This is a special type of high activity bacteria that we use. It's non-pathogenic and is commonly used in these kinds of studies. And so what we do now is we produce solids in the shape of anything we want, in this case, the shape of a brick. And we then simply add the bacteria and the aggregate and pump the urine solution through the mold, and eventually you get a solid forming. And in 2018, we produced the world's first biobrick grown from human urine. Now, in the first 5 days of the news article being released, there were 142 news hits in 23 countries, with over 48,000 social media shares and a potential reach of 248 million people. Needless to say, we were inundated with queries. And one of those queries was from Anglo Gold Ashanti, who contacted us to see if we couldn't make biobricks from their mine tailings using a similar process. And this is how this project was born. And so the idea is to use exactly the same process, but now instead of using sand, we use mine tailings as an aggregate. And we specifically were looking at repurposing copper mine tailings. Little did we know how challenging this would actually be, because we only started this in June last year, and because of the lockdown, experiments actually only started in August. So the results I'm about to present are very preliminary, and they have only been produced in the last few months or so. So as I showed you, essentially what we were doing previously was we were pumping a solution through the material, so our sand material. But we quickly realized this was not possible when using the mine tailings, simply because of the particle size. They were substantially smaller than the sand. And so what this graph shows us is that actually it's only achievable to pump the solution if you have 20% sand, 20% tailings and 80% sand, which is not practical. You don't want to have a combination of tailings and sand. So we quickly abandoned the pumping technique as a method. And then we moved on to what we call a submergent technique. So essentially we take molds of permeable material, so geotextile in this case, make a shape of a brick, and essentially submerge it in our cementation solution, which would be a combination of our urine and our calcium. And so this is what the system looks like. And we started with making columns simply because we could make a lot of them and then really understand what is happening with the process. So this is what it looks like when you simply just have the columns submerged in your cementation media. And so here are some of the results. So what you see here, we use the calcium as an indicator of the fact that the reaction is occurring, because when we have a reduction in the calcium concentration, it means calcium carbonate is forming. So what this graph shows us is that there's a gradual decrease in calcium for the sand, but a slower decrease when we're using copper tailings. In a similar vein, you could also use the ammonium production as an indication of your urea degradation. And we see a similar trend here, where the copper tailings have a slower gradual increase in ammonium production. So this is a column of sand being formed, and this is the mine tailings. And now there was an interesting observation, which I'm sure you can see from this, is that we had a crust forming around the mine tailings. And so when we essentially crushed the material to see how strong it was, we found that the sand compared very well, if not stronger than literature values, but the copper tailings column was substantially less. And so we thought that the main reason for this is actually the bacteria don't like a high copper concentration, and this is in fact the case. So we tried to acclimatize the bacteria by incrementally growing them in higher copper concentrations. But even after successively acclimatizing them to 600 milligrams per liter, which was similar to what the copper tailings were, they still gave similar results. And so this is just a comparison of the three: the sand, the mine tailings with using the normal bacteria, and then the climatized bacteria. We see that the shell isn't as fragile with the climatized bacteria, but it's certainly not as strong as the sand column. So then we moved on to see if, well, we couldn't look for urease producing bacteria in the mine tailings. So we took the mine tailings and then did a bulk collection, isolated distinct colonies and looked for different bacteria. And then simply there's a cool technique where basically you add this material, and if it turns pink, it shows an indication that urease is present. And after isolating some bacteria, we found one promising species, but unfortunately it didn't test positive for urease production. But this is something where we're going to continue looking at. Something else we did was that we looked at the calcium carbonate distribution between the sand column and then the copper tailings. And what you see from this graph is that for the sand, we had an equal distribution of calcium carbonate, so from the outer and the inner bit. But for the copper tailings, that shell component had a substantially higher concentration of calcium carbonate, further confirming that the calcium carbonate, or the MICP, was forming around that crust which encased the actual copper tailings. And when we look specifically at the particle size distribution and the so-called biocrust thickness, we see that the average particle size distribution of the sand is very small, 150 microns. But the tailings is even smaller, with only 10 microns. So our new hypothesis is that because of the substantially smaller particle size, you actually can't get nutrients and oxygen being transferred to the center of the column, and hence you don't solidify the column to the same thickness when you have bigger particles. So this is something we're going to be looking at. So what does this actually mean for making biosolids? So we've actually abandoned the production of biobricks, and now we're looking at thinner material simply because of this issue with the diffusion of oxygen and nutrients. Because the thinking is, if we can make thinner materials such as biotowels, we overcome these challenges, because now we can have a very thin material using essentially the same volume of aggregate, but not have to worry about the issues of not having a solid material in the interior, such as the brick or the column. Something else to further justify the move from biobricks to biotowels is simply that tiles are way more valuable. So what this graph is just to show us three scenarios where we have a base case with a very low usage efficiency, then 100% usage efficiency, and then also using waste nutrient broth rather than buying nutrient broth, which is what we do in the lab. And we see that there's a substantial profit to be made when using or producing biotowels. So one other thing, because this talk is actually also about dust suppression and the repurposing of mine tailings and how this can mitigate dust suppression, I think this is actually really promising, because this crust formation has the potential to form a very thin crust using dust and therefore encapsulate the dust particles. And this is actually also part of an AngloGold Ashanti funded project where we're looking at these aspects. So I'll leave you with this final quote. Pollution is nothing but the resources we are not harvesting. We allow them to be dispersed because we've been ignorant of their value. Thank you. So this is just an acknowledgement to the many wonderful students that have made all this work possible. And then also to our collaborators and funders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dyllon, for that interesting presentation. I take it the questions will be coming soon. And now it's time to hear what Helene-marie has to present to us, which will complement some of the statements that you've said. Helene-marie, it's your time.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Hello. So I've done some research a while back on the transfer of waste valorization or waste reuse technologies to South Africa, and specifically the South African coal mining industry. And so I'll give my thoughts on the factors that are likely to influence the implementation of this super exciting technology that Dr. Randall and his team is working on. And this is really with the understanding that if we don't implement our technologies, then they won't have the impact on society that we're hoping they would have, that we come to the lab excited about. And so the first thing I think that is worth saying is that if this technology is implemented on a mine, it will likely be implemented by a small player that the mines pay to do it, to pay for their services. In the case of dust suppression as a solution, so mines will pay a company to suppress their dusts. Mines will most likely not be the ones to do it themselves. Or they might sign a management or an offtake agreement with the smaller company, especially if they want to make biobricks or biotiles. And yeah, so it's not the mines that will be implementing it themselves, most likely. And this is despite the fact that AngloGold Ashanti approached Dr. Randall and his team. And this is because the mine's business model is to produce ores. They don't necessarily have the technical ability to implement new technologies themselves. They normally outsource the more technical work to technology providers. And because they're not set up to run smaller side businesses from their operations. For instance, their marketing teams have targets on how many tons per month they're supposed to move. They don't want to be bothered to sell bricks to Builders Warehouse, right? It's distracting. And similar with finance and technical departments. So biobrick projects also typically have relatively small revenue streams compared with the mine's core business, which means that if the mine does implement it, some of my respondents have found that these projects then get neglected to the point where they fail, simply because the revenue isn't big enough to make someone at a mine pay attention, but a smaller player for whom it's their livelihood is much more likely to make it a success. So yeah, therefore, I would recommend that Dr. Randall and his team start thinking about how they'll see this implementation going. So whether they would be interested in spinning off a company themselves to implement the technology on behalf of the mines, or whether they would like to hand over the technology to, as it were, to a technology provider who can then sell it as part of their suite of technology solutions. Another alternative that is likely to get mines involved and excited is if the technology turns out to be simple enough to include the community and to have it implemented as part of a mine's social and labor plan. So yeah, if it can be simple enough for the communities to form a business and run this, then that would obviously be very exciting for the mines. But you would need to get past the source of the bricks, perhaps as a cultural issue. I don't know, but that is another project for another day. So why do I recommend that they start thinking about implementing now when there are still so many technical issues to understand and to solve? The reason is that co-developing solutions with an organization that will implement it will most likely make this a lot more of a sticky solution. Companies are much more likely to implement technologies that they feel they understand well, they know well, and have the in-house expertise to support. And also, there's a lot to say for having skin in the game. It would also influence where you go and look for funding. Maybe the implementing company would like to fund some aspects of the research themselves. And if a company is going to take this technology, they might also prefer to not have the intellectual property on the technology being public domain, which is something that is mandated by certain funders. Okay, so moving on to some specific barriers and enablers that I identified as part of my research and as applied to Dr. Randall's context. Don't underestimate the importance of a credible business case, obviously both for the business's survival, but also for mines to take you seriously. When I did my research, 2 respondents started off the interview, like the first words they said were about how important a business case was. This was before I even asked my first question. And yeah, so you need to have a market for your product. You need to have financing and a clear idea of what the value proposition for the customers are, as well as for what it is for the mine is. Why are these things important to a mine, you might ask, since I've just said that they're unlikely to implement the technology. But remember, it's their waste that Dr. Randall might want to use. And mining waste is associated with huge liabilities, especially in terms of the Water Act. This means that mines will want to be sure that the operator they sell to or give the waste to will have a legitimate business. If they sell their waste to someone who just ends up dumping it a few kilometers down the road, they will most likely once again have to go and answer for that waste and incur expenses to move it or make it safe where it is. So that means they will want to be convinced that the business plan is credible and that the technology works on their material. I think Dr. Randall illustrated nicely why it is imperative to be sure that technology works on a specific material. So these questions will be answered through lab scale work and piloting. Some of my respondents recommended including commercial research organizations like the CSIR or Mintic in the piloting phase, because they simply have more experience in doing piloting than universities tend to have. And here it will be important to test the robustness of the technology. Mine waste is inherently variable and often poorly characterized. One of my correspondents said something like, working with mine waste is like standing in the dark, not knowing what you're going to get. This is because mines, like any raw material producer, must make sure that their product is standardized. That means that all the variability in their ores end up in the waste, which can therefore be quite variable. So technology robustness is quite important. And also the technology piloting process can be long and expensive. And this opens the developing team up to technology risk, because if the technology doesn't work, the bills must still be paid. It also opens them up to market risk, because people may not like rustic tiles anymore by the time the development work is done. Who knows? So these risks must be managed during piloting. The results from piloting must then also be made known to industry so that they can start getting comfortable with the idea, and then less energy has to be spent later on convincing people of an idea. It's also a good idea to make your piloting facility visitable so that people can actually go and see it working, and be convinced of its efficacy. Lastly, I think it's worth mentioning that the legal environment into which this technology will be implemented will also play a part. So the South African legal system is a bit of a double-edged sword, unfortunately. On the one hand, simply disposing of waste is becoming more expensive than it's ever been, due to the regulations requiring linings for tailings facilities to make, and waste heaps to make them safe. And so mines are actually trying to find different ways of managing their waste. On the other hand, the confusion and onerous nature of some of the regulations are preventing mines from trying new and innovative approaches. For instance, mines must ask permissions if they want to change some of their on-site infrastructure. So yeah, I think being aware of these issues and opportunities will set the developing team up for successful implementation. And it is very exciting to think that something that the mining industry and society at large consider hazardous or worthless can potentially become useful and contribute to a well-functioning society. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Helene-marie, for bringing out that context, which is the other side of the same coin. So now that will take us into our Q&A session. We've got a bit of time, roughly about 20 minutes, to deal with the Q&A session. For those that might not have made note of this, Camilla sent a good piece of advice on how this is going to happen. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or alternatively post it in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. Then we can have the respective presenter try and address it. And since it's a collaborative platform, we can also have participants within the room also as attempting to answer some of the questions which might be within their field of expertise. So I don't know who will take us or kick us off on the first question.
There's a question there from Philip Garish in the chat. He said, you mentioned the compressive strength of the bricks tiles. What about their durability or wear resistance? And I think that's for Dyllon.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So yes, I only mentioned compressive strength as one of the parameters that we're testing, but we obviously have to test a very wide range of things. So this is something that we would be doing with the final products that we make. Yeah.
Harold Anagan, yeah, may I make a comment, question to?
Yes, Harold, you may go through.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by your mention, Dyllon, of the possibility of dust suppression by forming surface crusts. I'm long time involved in dust monitoring of the gold mine tailings, and the first initial response is that gold mine tailings are not a suitable material for bricks because of the residual radioactivity. For a long time that's been suppressed, but the possibility of forming a crust. On the other hand, you yourself mentioned the issue that what is regarded as pollution is just waste, is just material not recognized, and the surface gold mining industry no longer call them mine dumps, but tailing storage facilities, and their plans going out for a further 50 years for reprocessing some of the tailing storage facilities for a third time. So permanent crusting is not an option, but there's one mining sector which really does require a permanent cementatious sealing, because all other means have been subject to biological decay. Can you immediately think what it is, Dyllon?
No.
If not, I'll tell you. Asbestos tailings.
Ah.
So whatever vegetation you put on asbestos is subject to meteorological, biological decay, either from animal trampling or insects. So eventually the asbestos fibers will be released from those old facilities. So somehow obtaining a means of a cementatious crust that would not be subject to, at least to biological disturbance, could be a well, is there, and to my mind, that's the single most dangerous type of tailing, because there's no way of chemically altering or removing it or extracting a value out of the residual material. So
I think that's a very good point.
That's a comment that I wish to make.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Harold. And Dyllon has noted that. I saw Helene-marie's hand up, and then after that, I'll take Bruno.
Okay, sorry, Dyllon. I'm really just curious. How do you wash these things without killing your bugs?
So essentially what you do, you don't have to wash them, right? Like so the interesting thing, I think you mentioned it in your talk, where you spoke about the social aspects of it. And so when people hear urine, they immediately think of the yuck factor and, oh, I don't want to do this and I don't want to whatever. But what we've realized is that actually, sure, we're using urine, but we're only taking one component from that. We're only taking the calcium and we're only taking the carbonate ions to make calcium carbonate. And that's what we use to cement the particles together. Everything else gets flushed out of the system or stays in that tank, which we can do other things with. But we are only removing two things from the urine, the calcium and the carbonate. And that's actually not a bad thing. So when you take the brick out of, or the brick or the column out of, say, the mold or the submergent tank, it will have a strong ammonia smell, because if you remember that reaction, that's one of the byproducts that fall. But if we keep the pH low, that ammonia is rather in the ammonium form, which we could then use to make another fertilizer. So that's something I didn't mention. And so when you form these biomaterial, if the pH is high, you will have a strong ammonia smell. But you leave it out to dry, within a day, that ammonia has completely dissipated. So the brick itself has no smell. There's no other things wrong with it. I once had a person, I think it was on Twitter, someone asked, it was the weirdest thing, they asked, can we eat it? I didn't know how to respond to that. Like, why would you want to eat a brick? So this has been a really interesting journey, and has taught me a lot about the social aspects and the things that people focus on when they hear the word urine. And I think it's just part of the education that we have to do, and these kind of talks help with that, where you disseminate the knowledge, but more importantly, you start subtly creating these paradigm shifts in how we view waste. So I liked when Harold said people are no longer calling it a mine dump. They're specifically changing the terminology we use. So no longer calling something a wastewater treatment plant, but you call it a resource recovery plant. And it's subtle, but it has a lot of impact. And I think that's extremely useful. Yeah. Sorry, I went on a tangent there.
Thank you, Dyllon. Thank you, Helen. Bruno, your question before we head to Ishak.
Okay. I would say that definitely the problems you experience with the tailings is a permeability issue. I don't know if you guys did any mineralogy on the copper tailings, but generally copper tailings have very little copper in them. because, you know, that's what the mine is trying to get out.
Mm.
So there might be other heavy minerals in there that's an issue, but my feeling is permeability is the main issue. So just like we do in wastewater, I would think maybe it's better to actually find a bacteria that has an anaerobic reaction that doesn't need the oxygen, so that you can embed that in there without the oxygen, and it still does its thing. And that sort of brings me to, okay.
Sorry. So I think it's a fantastic point, because that's actually the outcome of the student that worked on it. So he just submitted his thesis yesterday. And this is the recommendation, is really to find a bacteria that doesn't need oxygen, that can live in those conditions. However, we still have the challenge, though, if the material is too thick, what happens is, or the product you want to make is too thick, what happens is, because you're having the formation of solids between the particles, eventually the nutrients can't get to where they need to be. So we are also limited by that. There are many challenges that we've realized that we actually didn't understand when we first started this. Because when we used the pumping technique, it worked really well, and we went ahead with this, and then Anglo contacted us, and we thought, okay, this will be easy. But yeah, I guess this is the fun part of research, that there's so many unknowns, and it gives us a lot more.
And then the pumping technique, I didn't really understand how that works, but I would something I would suggest is that what's maybe more important in some instances is what we're doing, what a couple of mines have started to do, is actually put the tailings back underground to fill the voids. And, you know, first of all, that's sort of, call it a permanent storage, but also it provides regional stability, and more importantly, it encapsulates acid generating rock and essentially stops acid mine drainage. And this sort of mine backfilling doesn't need high strengths. But you do need an anaerobic bacteria, because you won't have a lot of oxygen down there. So how strong is strong? Because anything up to 1 MPa would be good enough to use it as backfill in the mines. And that's probably a maybe more promising sort of thing, because the mines would invest directly in that, because that would be an operational thing that they have to do to fill up the voids also, so they can mine right next to them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is a fantastic idea, and it's something we had never thought about. But to answer your question about the compressive strength, so when we first started, the highest we had was 0.9 megapascals when we just used pure sand. And within the space of 18 months, we increased it to 16 megapascals, simply by understanding the chemistry and the microbiology. So we have anywhere from 0.5 all the way to 16 with the potential to increase in terms of the strength, if we can overcome all those other challenges with using the copper tailings. But yeah, I really like this idea of using it as
apart from the fact that you are cementing the stuff, we have to cement it in any case when we put it down there, because you can't have it liquefy. But you're putting in a lot of cement, and cement costs a lot of money. So it's not a question maybe of creating something that you can sell, but it's a question of saving that. And you know, cement is not the greenest thing in the world. It takes a lot of energy to produce. So, you know, just not using cement is already beneficial.
No, it's a very, very good point. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Bruno. There are quite a number of questions, and all of them are coming through the chat. So I'll kindly remind people to use the Q&A section so that I'm able to follow. Dyllon, this is directed at you. What is the maximum brick or column size that you think is possible to achieve uniform MICP cementation with sufficient penetration? That is coming from Ethan.
Again, a very good question. So I have a PhD student. I actually had a chat with her today, and that's the next planned experiment, is really to look at the particle size of an inert material such as sand. So we want to have 4 different sizes, and then look at the biocrust formation, but then also the compressive strength, and to start determining, if we want a strength of X, what should the particle size be, and then how thick will the crust be. So I don't have a direct answer, but it's something we're looking at. Yeah.
Dylan, just a follow-up question as we head to the next question. I think it's by Aisha and Megan. In those particle sizes that you're talking about, what will be the influence of the number of particles within a certain size?
I mean, I think all these are very good questions, but I don't have the exact answer, and it's something that we certainly have to be looking at. I can say that when we made the first bio columns, which gave us the 0.9 megapascals, it was sand, right? So pure sand. And we tripled the strength by using a mixture of sand and grey-walkie aggregate, which is what they use in the concrete lab. So grey-walkie, think of like a quarry and the leftover crushed material. So we did 50% sand, 50% grey-walkie, and we tripled the strength. So the size of the particles and the number of particles directly influences the strength of the material we make. We just don't understand it well enough to give you a direct answer, but it's something we're looking at. Yeah. My students are going to be very busy.
Thank you. I'll take Megan's question. I think it's a follow-up to Bruno's contribution. The majority of copper mine tailings are likely to have a significant component of clay materials that will reduce permeability. I think this is really...
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it. It's by simply pumping it, no matter what we did, we could not pump the material. And that was a quick indication that this is problematic. And hence we moved to the submergent technique. What we are now potentially going to look at is almost like a spraying technique. So the idea would be you have a super thin layer, you get the crust forming, and then you put another thin layer. And so think of it almost like 3D printing in a way. But you have a thin layer, crust forming, solidification, and then another thin layer. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Now, the follow-up question from Didi, directed at you again, Dylan. Is there a reason why blending of sand and tailings haven't been explored?
The simple answer was Anglo wasn't interested in that simply because they want to repurpose their mine tailings and they don't want to look at having to mix it with other aggregates. That's the simple answer. I mean, it's something we would like to look at, but they're the funders, so we have monthly meetings with them, and they basically guide us of where things go. So we're having another meeting tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. They were hoping that this might have a bit of a different impact in the diffusivity challenges that you were talking about.
I have no doubt it does. So like I mentioned, when we simply looked at a combination of sand and grey-walkie, we tripled the strength. So I'm pretty sure that we would overcome many of these issues if we could look at a combination. But yeah, they didn't want to do that.
That takes me to Vanessa's question. I'm trying to rush, we don't have time. Is it possible to apply the technology to abandoned mines where state funding could be accessed? Just thinking of the many Witwatersrand tailings and what this land could be used for, and demand for land increases in urban areas. So just repurposing the mine tailings, also giving way to possible reuse of the land where those mine tailings used to exist.
Yeah, look, the crazy thing about this technology is there's substantial uses, right? Like I've just mentioned essentially two, using mine tailings and other aggregates. But you can use it for geotextile, geotechnical aspects where you reinforce soils, so you essentially make them stronger. You can use it for self-healing concrete. I mean, how crazy is this? Where you have bacteria in your concrete, and when it cracks, the bacteria basically heal crack by forming calcium carbonate. And it's using the same kind of principles. So there's substantial techniques or aspects that we could look at, and that other researchers are already doing. So yeah.
Okay. Then the next question is from Sage. Super interesting research. Have you looked at anything else besides tiles and bricks? How thin are the tiles, and could you maybe use this material as mortar or render or plastering instead?
Again,
out of fashion.
So when this started, it was really as a crazy idea, to be honest, right? It was really just my curiosity to know whether I could do this or not, because I was working in Switzerland in the urine field, and I came back, I heard about MICP, and I was wondering whether we could use urine or the urea in urine to do this. That's how it was born. I didn't anticipate any of this. And I think that for me is the beauty of research. You do one thing and then it just goes everywhere. And so I think, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, because you can make pretty much any product you can think of that would need some kind of biocement to glue materials together. So we're not restricted to biobricks and biotiles. It's just what we're focusing on at the moment. But I think there's a lot of potential.
So this now is coming back closer home. That's Aisha's question. She's asking about whether the interest at UCT in terms of collecting the urine for repurposing has grown, and how are the other kinds of stakeholders' engagement on the matter?
So it's a fantastic question, and I love giving the story. So if you bear with me, I know we're supposed to end at 3, but I don't mind spending another 10 minutes or so, if that's allowed, to answer more questions. So when I joined Switzerland in 2015, it was part of a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project called Reinvent the Toilet. And that's how I got into urine, of all things. My background, by the way, was in mining. I did my PhD in treating mining wastewater. So I feel I've come full circle back to where I started. So when I was in Switzerland, my boss took me to the bathroom and showed me a container and said, "Oh, that's where we collect your pee." I was like, "What?" He said, "Yeah, you need to pee in here and we're going to use it in the experiments." And I remember thinking in my head, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? He wants me to pee in that container, and this is going to be my life for the next 2 years. Anyway, I do it, I do the work, I get really into it, I see a lot of potential. I come back to South Africa in 2017, and the irony is I get my students and staff and colleagues to do exactly the same thing, to pee into a container. And I say that that is the power of education, because once I understood why we need to do this, it was very easy for me to motivate other people to do it. And when we first started collecting urine at UCT, it would take between 4 to 5 days to fill a 25-liter container of urine. After the news of the biobrick broke and it went viral, essentially, we had people from all over campus coming to our building because they wanted to donate their urine because they thought it was going to go into the next biobrick. It didn't. I mean, we were doing other things with it. And prior to COVID, it would now take between 6 to 8 hours to fill the same 25-liter container. And again, I think that's the power of education, because you are sharing this kind of novelty with people and they get excited about it and then they want to be involved. Yeah.
Thank you, Dyllon, for that. That takes me to the next question by Harmon, and I know we've got more than 9 questions outstanding. Calcium hydroxide. You and I both know that calcium hydroxide is a reagent. Yes, it's on the cheaper end of the neutralization reagents, but it has a footprint too. Have you investigated calcium oxide slags? So
it's a good question. No, we haven't directly looked at calcium oxide, but what we did do, but bear in mind, this was in a lab setting. Sorry?
From a slag perspective.
No, so we just used lab-scale calcium oxide. And the reason I mentioned this and the reason we don't use calcium oxide is because there's an exothermic reaction and we had the temperature of the urine increasing. What I didn't mention is while urea can degrade enzymatically, so when you have the urease bacteria present, it can also degrade chemically. So it degrades if you above 40 degrees or if your pH is above 13. And so we want to prevent that degradation from occurring. And so we didn't want an exothermic reaction. And that's why we went with calcium hydroxide instead.
Maybe modifying it and putting a pre-treatment step to the slags where you can then form
possibly,
your
I mean, one other thing so I'm collaborating with Swedish researchers, and we are looking at using magnesium oxide and hydroxide as well as ash. So when you make a brine and you have ash left over from wood and whatever, it's actually got a lot of magnesium oxide and hydroxide in it. And it's very good at stabilizing urine. The pH isn't as high though, it's around 10, but it's still sufficient to retaining your urea in solution.
Okay. Next question is asking, couldn't you do a systematic approach to this where you build up layers on the bricks instead of having one brick, then break?
So it's the 3D printing aspect that I mentioned. That's something while it's not technically 3D printing, what we're going to look at is like a spraying technique, where you have a thin layer, you spray your nutrients, you solidify that, and then you put more aggregate, and so you go on.
I'll have to take a question from Magdi. His hand has been up for some time. Magdi, your question. The balance of the question
thank you.
is answered via email.
I want to really say thank you. Your research is amazing, specifically from that part that you say you're back to UCT in 2017, and now in 4 years you are associate professor. You see, it's good that you go through all of those tough parts, but you eventually, in the short time, you get the response back. Mainly, my question was around the particle size and using the real material instead of sand. And you say it's around 10 micron. And normally, I don't know if you're talking about PST, you mean about PST is a distribution. You mean about like DAT was 10 micron, which is very low. Normally in angular-side, if PGM material, they have 10 micron. If not, normally in the range of 100 micron to 80 micron.
So, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's something we've been grappling with. I think we were just very unfortunate with the copper tailings because they are very fine in comparison to other copper tailings currently, according to literature. So we got unlucky with the fact that of all the tailings we could use, we were given copper tailings, and the bacteria specifically don't like copper. And then secondly, that the particle sizes were so much smaller than what you would find conventionally. To answer your question about the exact particle size, so it's really, I think it was the average particle size, if I remember correctly. I would just have to double check that, yeah.
Okay, thank you to everyone who's managed to participate, the SIMM and its members, the GCRF and its members, and the MTM members, and the whole group of friends from all over the world. I could see some people from as far as Australia who also joined us. Thank you for attending. The bulk of the questions that remained unanswered will be answered via email, so I'll direct the questions to the respective speaker who's supposed to answer. Another thank you to the speakers for availing themselves and their interesting work that they're doing. So we take it that the next time you'll be available. For those who belong to the Minedust network and who want to follow the series of presentation, the next one is on the 7th of April. So you can join us there. And for us as the SIMM team, you will get the mailer where the next presentations will be loaded and you'll be alerted to that. I think that will be all for this afternoon. And thank you once again to all the participants. And thank you for your patience as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Very well done. Bye-bye. Have a safe day.
Bye. Jenny.